The lawyer was still smiling when Eliot Cass walked out of the building into the February cold, and that smile stayed with him longer than anything else from that day. Longer than the judge's voice, longer than the sound of the gavel, longer than the moment his attorney leaned over and said, quietly, "It's done." Claire's lawyer, a man named Gerald Fitch who wore cufflinks shaped like anchors, had shaken hands with Claire on the courthouse steps like they'd just closed a real estate deal. Maybe they had. That's essentially what it was. Eliot had married Claire Renaud 11 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake, and now a court in Toronto had given her the vineyard. Not literally, they hadn't owned a vineyard, but it felt that way. The house in Leaside, the joint savings. The restoration workshop he'd spent 9 years building from a one-room rental in Scarborough into something that employed 7 people and had a waiting list 3 months long. Gone. Not all of it, technically, but enough. Enough that when he got into his car, the car they'd let him keep because Claire already had the truck, he sat for 4 minutes without turning the key. His daughter called him at a red light on the DVP. "Dad, how'd it go?" Her name was Hazel. She was 9 years old and already knew that the way perceptive children more than the question. "It went okay," he said. "Did you win?" He watched the light change. Not exactly. Silence. Then, "Are we going to have to move?" He told her no. He said it before he'd actually figured out whether it was true, because she was 9, and the light had changed and some answers you give your children, not because you know them to be true, but because the alternative is too large to fit inside a car on a Wednesday afternoon. He was 41 years old and he was starting over with a rented apartment in East York, a truck that needed new brakes, and a workshop he no longer legally owned. The workshop had been called Cass Restoration. Now it was just called Cass because Claire had taken the company shares as part of the settlement and the two of them had agreed. Through lawyers, not directly. They hadn't spoken directly in 14 months. That Eliot could continue operating it as an independent contractor under a licensing arrangement that cost him 22% of gross revenue every quarter. He hadn't consulted a second lawyer about whether this was legal or fair. He'd been exhausted in the way that follows grief, and grief is what a marriage ending actually is, regardless of whose fault it was or wasn't. He showed up to work the Thursday after the court date because there was nothing else to do. His foreman, a man called Augustin, who had been with him since the 2nd year, looked up from a mahogany writing desk they were refinishing and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look terrible. I know. You need coffee. I need a lot of things." Augustin brought him coffee in a mug that had the wrong lid on it so it dripped, and Eliot stood in the middle of the workshop with sawdust on his boots and drank it anyway. This is the part of the story that doesn't make it into the highlight reel. No one talks about the Thursdays. Everyone talks about what came after, about the helicopter, about Sloan. But what actually built Eliot Cass into the person the helicopter came for was the 1.5 years of Thursdays, of showing up, of getting Hazel to school at 7:45 and being in the workshop by 8:30, of taking every job that came in regardless of how small, of eating dinner most nights at a counter because the table in the new apartment was still in a box, of being so tired at 9 p.m. that he sometimes didn't make it to the couch. He never complained about it to anyone except Augustin, and even then rarely. He had a daughter who was watching him, and he understood, in the quiet, non-dramatic way that certain people understand things, that she was learning something about what a person does when the ground falls away. He intended to be worth learning from. The job that changed everything came in through a referral, which is how the best jobs always came in. A woman named Petra, who ran an auction house on Queen West, had sent him a call for a piece she described as a real disaster. The piece turned out to be a writing cabinet, 19th century English. Burled walnut with brass fittings that had been water damaged so severely that 3 other restorers had declined it. Someone had stored it in a garage in Oakville for 30 years. The veneer had lifted in sections. 2 of the interior drawers had warped shut. The brass was corroded past what most people would consider recoverable. Eliot took it. He charged a reasonable price, turned down a higher offer for the same slot, and spent 11 weeks on it. He brought Hazel in on a Saturday afternoon when he was in the middle of the veneer work, and she sat on a stool and watched him work and asked approximately 40 questions, and he answered all of them. The finished piece was photographed by Petra's team and posted on the auction house's account. Within 48 hours, it had been shared by 3 collectors' accounts, 2 furniture history blogs, and a woman whose profile photo showed her standing in front of what appeared to be a large airplane hangar. He noticed the hangar. He didn't think anything of it. Her name was Renata Voss. She was 47 years old, and she had been, for the past 6 years, the primary shareholder and acting chair of Voss Northern, an aerospace infrastructure company based out of Calgary with maintenance operations in Winnipeg, Edmonton, and a facility north of Thunder Bay that most people didn't know existed. She had inherited the company from her father at 39, when he died of a heart attack on a golf course in Phoenix, and she had spent the years since turning it from a profitable but directionless family business into something her father had never imagined it could be. She was not sentimental. She had been told this her entire life as though it were a flaw. She had come to understand it as a set of tools. The ability to make decisions before the emotion arrived, to see what was in front of her rather than what she wished were there. But she kept that photograph of the cabinet. She had it printed and framed, and she put it on the wall of her office in Calgary, across from the window, where she would see it every time she looked up. When her assistant asked about it, she said, "Because someone did the thing that 3 other people said couldn't be done, and they did it quietly, without making a fuss about it. Those are the people I want to know." Her assistant, a young man named Fletcher, who had never once failed to be prepared for her questions, looked the piece up within 2 hours and had Eliot's contact information on her desk by the end of the afternoon. Renata looked at it for a long time. Then she set it aside, because she had a board meeting in 40 minutes, and the board had been making her life difficult for months. Here is something you should understand about the kind of company Voss Northern had become under Renata's direction. It was, by most external measures, doing extraordinarily well. Revenue had increased. The Thunder Bay facility had become a regional hub. 2 international contracts had been signed that her father's company never could have attracted. The board was unhappy anyway. Not all of them. 3 of the 7 were genuinely supportive. But there was a faction, led by a man named Clifford, who had been on the board since Renata's father's time, and who clearly believed that she was managing a temporary situation until a more significant solution arrived, who questioned every significant decision she made. They questioned her acquisitions. They questioned her hiring. They questioned loudly and repeatedly the initiative she cared most about, a skills and trades partnership program she was developing with a network of small restoration and fabrication workshops across Ontario and Manitoba. The program was Renata's idea, and she knew it was right. The trades sector in Canada was facing a shortage that was going to become a crisis within 15 years if nothing changed at the institutional level, and the large companies that could actually move the needle were mostly not paying attention. Voss Northern could build something, a pipeline of trained, supported craftspeople connected to real commercial opportunity. That would matter. Not just for the company, for the sector. The board told her the ROI projections were speculative. She told them that everything worth doing involves speculative projections. They tabled it. She did not raise her voice. She gathered her materials and she thanked them for their time. And she walked out of the boardroom and stood by the window in the hallway for exactly 90 seconds, watching the parking lot. And then she went back to her office and called Fletcher. "Get me the file on that restorer," she said, "Cass, in Toronto." Eliot was in the middle of a debrief with Augustin when his phone rang with a Calgary area code. He almost didn't answer it. He had a policy about unknown numbers during work hours, which was to let them go to voicemail and return them at the end of the day. But something made him step out into the alley behind the workshop, where the bins were kept and where Augustin's radio never quite reached, and take the call. "Is this Eliot Cass?" "It is." "My name is Fletcher Good. I'm calling on behalf of Renata Voss at Voss Northern. She'd like to speak with you if you have time tomorrow afternoon. It concerns a potential partnership." He stood in the alley with exhaust and cold air mixing around him and said, "What kind of partnership?" "She'd prefer to explain it herself if that's all right." He told Fletcher it was all right. He stood in the alley for another minute after they hung up, looking at the sky between the buildings, which was that particular shade of Toronto winter gray that looks like everything is on pause. He had no idea what was coming. You should know that. He had absolutely no idea. The call with Renata lasted 40 minutes. She explained the program. She explained what she was looking for. Small workshops with proven track records, owners who understood both the craft and the business, people who could mentor and also scale. She had identified 11 potential partners across Ontario. She had spoken to 4 of them already. She told him this directly, without flattery, because that was how she operated. She asked him about his apprenticeship structure. He told her he had 2 apprentices currently, both of them former students from a George Brown trades program he'd lectured at twice, and that both had come in below skill level and were now doing work he was proud to put his name on. She asked how he'd manage that. He said, "You pay attention to what they don't know without making them feel stupid for not knowing it. And then you find the thing they're good at and you build their confidence there first." There was a pause on the line. "That's not what I expected you to say," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something about technique. Process. Most people talk about process. Process matters," he said. "But people have to believe they can do the thing before they can learn the process." Another pause, shorter. "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask the licensing arrangement you're operating under, the 22%. How long can you sustain that?" He hadn't told her about that. He took a breath. "You did your homework. I always do my homework." He looked at the wall of the workshop, the schedule board, the photographs of finished pieces, the invoice tacked up with a pushpin that he kept there to remind himself what good work looked like when someone else named the price. "Long enough," he said. "As long as I need to. I think we should meet in person," she said. "I have business in Toronto in 3 weeks. Would you be available?" He said he would. After the call ended, he sat at his desk and did not move for a while. Hazel was at her mother's this week. They'd settled into an arrangement, him and Claire, civil if not warm, 2 weekends a month and alternating Wednesdays. The apartment was quiet. He made himself dinner, which was pasta with the end of a jar of sauce, and he ate it at the counter. And he thought about what had just happened without quite knowing what to call it yet. She arrived in Toronto on a Tuesday. Fletcher had arranged a room at a hotel on Wellington, but Renata had asked to meet at the workshop, not at a boardroom or a restaurant, because she wanted to see the place. This was not a small thing. She had visited all 4 of the other workshops before making any decisions, always alone, always without announcement beyond a confirmed time. She walked in through the front, which most clients didn't do. Most clients came through the small reception area they'd built out of a repurposed closet, and stood in the workshop proper for a moment before Eliot came over. She looked exactly like her photographs. Tailored coat, good boots, the kind of posture that comes from having told you represent something for a long time. She also looked, and this surprised him, tired. Not visibly tired, not in the way that shows on the face. Something quieter behind the eyes. He shook her hand. "Eliot Cass, Renata Voss." She looked past it and piss on the main bench, a Victorian secretary desk. Halfway through its process, the upper cabinet doors removed and laid flat. "Can I look? That's why you wanted to come here." She walked around the bench slowly, not touching anything, just looking. He watched her look. She wasn't performing interest. She was actually interested, which were different things, and he'd learned by now to tell them apart. "The finish on the lower cabinet," she said. "Is that original? About 60%. There was damage on the left side. Water and some kind of solvent that someone used incorrectly, probably in the 70s. I matched the remaining original as closely as possible and used the same application method." "You can tell the difference if you know what you're looking for," she said. "Yes, that's intentional. I don't believe in hiding the repair completely. It happened. It should be visible to someone who looks carefully." She turned and looked at him then, directly, in the way she had that Fletcher had once described to a colleague as like she's checking if you actually mean what you just said. "That's an interesting philosophy," she said. "It's the only honest one." They went to a table in the back. Not an office, just a table where he sometimes ate lunch and sometimes met with clients, and talked for 2 hours. She laid out the program structure in detail. The funding model, which involved Voss Northern providing capital and operational support in exchange for a formal mentorship commitment and participation in a shared apprenticeship database. The timeline, the governance, the 5-year vision. He asked questions. Good questions, she noted. Not questions about money, primarily, but questions about autonomy, about what the workshops would and wouldn't be expected to change about how they operated, about what happened if the program didn't perform the way the models projected. "Then we adjust the models," she said. "Clifford won't like that answer." She stopped. "How do you know about Clifford?" "Voss Northern's board minutes are public. I read them last week." She looked at him for a moment with something that might have been satisfaction. "Clifford thinks the program is too speculative. Clifford has been on that board since 2009, and every significant growth initiative your company has made in the last 6 years has happened over his objections." She said nothing. "I also read the annual reports," he added. "Did you?" she said. "It wasn't quite a question. You asked me for a partnership. I wanted to know who I was talking to." She left at 4:30 and he walked her out to the front where a car was waiting. Before she got in, she turned back. "One more question." "Go ahead. Why did you take the Oakville cabinet? 3 other restorers declined it. You could have declined it." The margin wasn't worth the hours. He thought about it for a second. Because someone made that piece. A long time ago, someone sat down and built something meant to last, and then it got neglected and damaged, and everyone who looked at it decided it wasn't worth the effort. He paused. I don't think things stopped being worth the effort just because they got damaged. She got in the car. He went back inside. Augustin was pretending to work on the secretary desk but had clearly been watching the door. Well, he said. I have no idea, Eliot said, which was not entirely true. The board met again in Calgary 3 weeks later. Renata presented the updated program proposal with Eliot named as the lead Ontario partner. She had refined the projections. She had added a 5-year skills pipeline analysis prepared by a researcher at the University of Manitoba. She had anticipated every objection Clifford was likely to make and prepared a response to each one. Clifford made the objections anyway. The vote came down 4-3 against the proposal. Renata thanked the board for their time. She gathered her materials. She walked out of the boardroom and stood in the hallway and looked at the parking lot for 90 seconds, which was her habit. And then she made a decision she had been considering for 4 months. She called her lawyer from the car. She called her largest private investor from the hotel. She called Fletcher at 10:45 that night and told him to book travel to Toronto for the following Tuesday. Should I book a room on Wellington again, he asked. No, she said. Book the helicopter to the waterfront. I want to land close to the workshop. Eliot was in the alley again. It was where he went to think, the alley, without quite meaning to make it a habit, when he heard it. A low, rhythmic thrum that didn't belong to the street sound of a Tuesday morning in Toronto, building from northwest, and then a shadow crossing the roofline of the warehouse across the lane. He looked up. The helicopter was large and black, marked with a logo he recognized, the VN that appeared on Renata's business card and every piece of company correspondence he'd received. It was descending toward the parking lot at the end of the block, the big flat one used by the film crews that rented the warehouses. And it was clearly doing so with purpose. He stood in the alley and watched it land. He didn't move for about 30 seconds. He was thinking about Hazel, specifically about a conversation they'd had the weekend before, when she'd asked him if things were getting better at work. And he'd said yes, carefully, because it was true and because he'd wanted to be able to say yes was actually true rather than just say it. He was thinking about the cabinet in Oakville. He was thinking about the 9 years of Thursdays. He was thinking about the 22%, which he paid every quarter without complaint, which had cost him more than money. Fletcher came through the parking lot first, moving quickly, and then Renata, in a coat that wasn't suited to the Toronto cold and boots that were, her face carrying that quiet tiredness he'd noticed the first time, and which he now understood was something she carried with her regardless of circumstance. She walked up to him in the alley between the bins and the back wall, which was not a dignified setting for whatever this was, but neither of them mentioned it. The board voted no, she said. I heard. She looked at him steadily. I'm restructuring the program. I'm moving it outside the board's jurisdiction. Direct investment, private funding, with a different governance structure. It will take 4 months to set up properly. But when it's set up, I'd like you to be the lead partner for Ontario and eventually for the national expansion. That's a significant offer. I know what it is. He looked at her. Behind her, the helicopter sat in the parking lot, and a small group of people who worked in the surrounding warehouses had gathered at a respectful distance, watching. Because you didn't see that kind of thing in this part of the city on a Tuesday morning and people were human. Why me? He said. You had 11 workshops on your list. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, it was with the precision of someone who had decided to say a thing and meant to say it accurately. Because you answered a question about mentorship by talking about how people need to believe they can do something before they can learn to do it. Because you read 4 years of board minutes before agreeing to meet with me. Because 3 people told you a piece of furniture wasn't worth saving, and you saved it anyway, and you did it without telling anyone how difficult it was. She paused. And because when your entire life was taken apart in a courtroom and you had every reason to be bitter about it, you showed up to work the next day and you kept showing up. He hadn't told her the last part. He looked at her. Fletcher is thorough, she said. The sound of the city came back in. Traffic, someone's radio from the building across the lane, a streetcar somewhere on Dundas. Normal things. I have conditions, he said. I expected you would. The licensing arrangement with my ex-wife's company ends. If I'm a lead partner, I need the workshop back under my own name and my own ownership. I can make that happen. My apprentices come with me, both of them. Full compensation, full benefits, equivalent to any other partner workshop in the program, done. And the program's governance includes practitioner representation. The workshops have a voice in the structure. This doesn't get decided for us. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at the secretary desk, actually looking, not performing it. Those are reasonable conditions. Then yes, he said. She put her hand out and he shook it, there in the alley behind his workshop with a helicopter in the parking lot and strangers watching from a distance and the February cold of Toronto doing what it always did, which was remind you that you were alive and present and somewhere specific on the earth. Hazel was at school when he called her. He didn't call during school hours as a rule, but he called during school hours this once, because some things don't wait for the right time. She picked up immediately, which meant she'd been waiting, which meant she'd known in the particular way she always knew things that today was the kind of day you picked up. Dad? It went okay, he said. A pause. Did you win? He looked at the sky between the buildings, still gray, still that particular Toronto winter gray, and thought about the word. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I think we did. The helicopter had already lifted back off the parking lot by then. He could hear it fading north toward the lake, toward the open sky. He stood in the alley and listened until it was gone, and then he went back inside to work.